For those who are new to UNEG, it's a voluntary network of more than 40 evaluation offices in the UN system. And one of the things that we're trying to promote is the active knowledge sharing among UNEG members. So we organize this type of a webinar to serve as a platform to discuss risk issues in evaluation and development. And today we have a very important and exciting theme for discussion. That was from the MDG era, delivering on the world's biggest promise. We have 3 presenters today who have recently completed their evaluations on MDGs in their respective organizations. So we're going to give each one of them about 10 to 15 minutes for their report. And we would like to open the floor for discussion. Today, we heard that there are at least 130 people registered online for this webinar, so we have a really big crowd. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Before I think we move on to the main presentation, we would like to invite Nick York from the World Bank. He's the Director of Country Corporate and Global Evaluations Independent Evaluation Group for your opening remarks. Next, please.
Thank you, Fumika. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yes.
I'm going to reassure you that I'm going to be very brief because I think everybody wants to hear these. Just on behalf of the World Bank, I'd just like to welcome everybody as well and to say pleased to be part in one of these events. And we do want the World and IEG to play a bigger role as possible in helping with the learning and relationship. Of course, Shaolin will present some of our recent work where we've looked back at the bank's experience, the group's experience with the MDGs, and we've learned quite a lot of lessons for ourselves on what is in these global development goals and making them actually happen in practice, and the important role of partners at every level in that process. So looking forward to the discussion, and I'd like to thank UNEG for making these things happen. I think they're an incredibly important public good and much appreciated. Back to you in New York.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So now I'd like to briefly introduce you to the presenters for this afternoon in the order of their presentation. First is Shaolin Sun, Senior Evaluator at the World Bank Independent Evaluation Group. She's been working at the bank and she has worked on several positions, including work at the IFC, the World Bank, Europe, and then the Central Asia region. She's going to talk about the report titled "The Results" and then the performance of the World Bank Group completed last year. Second, we have Mr. Olivier Cosset from our office, UNDP Independent Evaluation Office. He's the evaluation manager since 2010, and he's recently completed this evaluation of the role of the UNDP in supporting national achievement of the MDGs. And the report was recently discussed at the board in June, the UNDP. And third, we have Ellen Benke, evaluation officer from UNOIOS, Office of Internal Oversight Services. She served as a team leader there for the last 9 years. And today she's going to present her recent thematic evaluation of monitoring and evaluation of the MDGs, which focuses on lessons learned for the post-2015 era. So, without further ado, shall we go to Shaolin?
Okay, thank you. The discussion here. So, what I'm going to present is a recent IED annual report, actually. Not annual report, annual evaluation analysis report of the World Bank Group's performance over the past year. And every year, this result and performance report, we call RAP, has a special theme. And this year's special theme is the MDGs. Therefore, what I'm going to talk about actually is really the first part of that report. Okay, so basically we have 5 messages from this part of the review. Actually, before we get into it, I need to clarify that this is not an evaluation as really understand that the evaluation is really part of synthesis review. So it's mainly a desktop study with some interviews of the colleagues in Washington, and very selected interviews by phone, but we didn't have field visits. So it's in that context we come up with these 5 key messages. So the first message is looking at the World Bank, we see that one strength was the bank group was able to integrate the MDGs into its strategies, but at the same time pursuing a broad poverty reduction approach. So very briefly, even before the MDGs were adopted, the World Group's strategies already incorporated the MDG themes. And there are twin pillars of this strategy, which is private sector-led growth and social human development. And that twin-pillared approach has been preserved in the following years through the MDG era. At Bank Group, despite internal external perceptions of ignoring the MDGs, actually was one of the first to endorse the MDGs. That happened in 2001. In particular, the bank strategy saw 2 key benefits of the framework. One is a results-based framework for assessing results, development impact. Another one is the bank saw the MDGs as providing a contact for donor coordination and country engagement. In following years, especially 2007, there was a review of this strategy, and also 2010, following the UN MDG Summit, the bank group adjusted its approach. In particular, called for greater focus on institutions and governance, as well as some other issues like global public goods and more attention to appropriate instruments and results management. But one of the things that really got emphasized was institutions in governance, achievement of the MDGs. In order to guide the World Bank Group's engagement during this period, the Bank Group developed a selectivity framework that had very outlined the principles for the Bank Group's engagement at a global level, sector level, as well as country level, and this was in the subsequent country strategies, sector strategies, as well as the lending portfolio. Very early on, the Bank Group, in endorsing the MDGs, also identified some risks, which was the uncertain financial sustainability issues and institutional weaknesses within the country. And very importantly, later on, and it turned out to be the key problems that the Bank Group, the World Bank Group, encountered in delivering results. And the second message we identified was the group was able to provide key intellectual underpinnings to the global development thinking. There are 2 levels of this. One is at a global level, really to how do I say, to have inputs into drive the thinking process. These are at a higher level, and another level was more direct knowledge support to our country clients. So at a higher level, there were many World Bank's World Development reports that were influential, that were critical in driving both the thinking and especially the World Bank's strategies and our lending approaches. Among these, I would like to cite the 1990 WDR on poverty, and the 2004 that are on making services work for the poor, These are very important reports that drove our both strategy and also especially the sector strategies. The World Bank was also able to use its statistical capacity to help with setting with both the IDGs, International Development Goals, these predate the MDGs, as well as MDGs in terms of setting of analyzing the goals, targets, and indicators. A greater emphasis was put on the quantifiability of the goals. So they tried to narrow down on the goals and the targets that could be measured, and there was reasonable availability of data. A lot of care was given to that. Another area was impact evaluations. The World Bank Group set different or participated in different initiatives. One is the DIME, Development Impact Evaluation Initiative, that's in our research group, as well as the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. These initiatives led to a really rapid growth of impact evaluations being conducted. However, they need to mention that IEG evaluation has found that the production of these impact evaluations has not always translated into providing useful inputs to operations. So this is still an area of weakness we see on two tracks of these things. And the more concrete level, the World Bank Group has also provided a lot of knowledge support, both in terms of research, analytical work, but especially in non-lending technical assistance. This has increased very fast. And we also saw a trend which was in the areas or the MDGs that bank's lending program hasn't grown or even proportionally has declined vis-a-vis the other areas. The knowledge services has increased. So, for example, World Bank's lending increased in MDG 2, 3, 4, and 6. These are precisely areas that World Bank's knowledge services didn't grow, but in the other MDGs. So these two are more complementary. However, at the same time, I also need to say that evaluations have found, at least in country, at the country program level, the best results were achieved when lending and analysis went hand in hand, not address different issues. So this is an area that we're signaling to our operational colleagues to pay attention. So the third key message was that at the country program level, the bank group had achieved some success in terms of translating these high-level MDGs into country programs through a country-based model. So the Monterey consensus in 2002 already emphasized upfront the country leadership in achieving the MDGs. From that, the bank group really gave a lot of focus, the emphasis to country focus in our country programs. This was supported by the organizational changes that was initiated in the 1990s. A big component of that was decentralization. So the bank group made a lot of effort to strengthen the country offices and moved, in particular, the country directors closer to the clients. So that was a big support of this country-based model. At the same time, even before the MDGs were adopted, there was a period that lots of new instruments were introduced, which proved to be really essential for the bank groups to channel bank group funding and knowledge services to the country clients. That very important one was the PRSP in either country. Also the HIPIC, the Indebted Poor Country Initiative, multilateral debt reduction initiatives. These were widely used to resource to social sectors that proved to be really very important. At the World Bank country strategy level, what we found was the any themes which not necessarily the MDG terms were substantially incorporated into the strategies. What that means was that if you had the country strategies of the World Bank Group, you don't see a lot of MDGs being referred to, but about 80% of the strategy addresses MDG areas. And there's a stable use of MDG indicators for measuring results. This hasn't really increased since the late 1990s to today. It's about 35–38% of the indicators that used in measuring results at the country level that were MDG-specific indicators. This hasn't changed. That basically reflected the portfolio. We had 9 country cases that we looked at more in depth, and we found that there is a significant variability between how much the MDGs were incorporated into a country program. Because of the scale of our exercise, it's a desktop review, so we couldn't really get to the bottom of these issues. But at least we could refute a few, hypotheses, which was MDG. At first, we thought MDGs could be less of an issue for middle-income countries or the fragile and conflict-affected countries. We couldn't really find evidence for that. So it was really support. Actually, in some of the really high, more developed countries like Brazil, there is a lot more emphasis on the MDGs. This was mainly driven by country demand. They really wanted the World Bank to help them in the environmental sector, for example. So a lot of the high proportion of the bank's support actually went to some areas that happened to be measured by the MDGs. But what we see was really that was driven by country demand. IEG's evaluations highlight some of the tensions in the work, the World Bank's model. So the fundamental model of the World Bank's engagement at the country level was the very much country-focused model. This has the benefit of being responsive to client needs, but at the same time, we have found that that makes it very difficult to incorporate global and sectoral priorities. One of the issues of the MDGs as a global initiative to make them really work well, integrate that into the country-based model. This is a challenge going forward that the World Bank's operational team really need to pay attention to. The message, and then the fourth message was about partnership. So what we found was the World Bank engaged in a partnership, achieving MDGs at various levels. And, there are lots of gaps here. Start with the selectivity framework that I referred to earlier, provided the basic principles, the guidelines for work in partnership with other donors and the country clients. That what we could observe was there was an explosion of trust funds. There are 3 categories of them. These trust funds offered lots of opportunities for the World Bank to scale up its operations, but at the same time also the new challenges of how to make them work the best. So we found was that there were 3 categories of these trusts, which was really the cornerstone of the partnerships for the World Bank. So for World Bank executives trust funds, they're very well integrated into the bank's regular monitoring evaluation system. So the effectiveness of these projects could be followed, could be assessed easily. Similarly, recipient executive trust funds following the same procedure as the recent trust funds reforms. However, the most important or the trust funds that experienced the fastest growth was what we call the financial intermediary fund. That was just the fund in terms of dollar values, also in terms of the growth, the pace of growth. These, however, were not integrated into the World Bank's operational, the MNE system. Each of these were expressed, they were created to support the specific MDGs. Each of them has its own governance structure and operating modalities, and we have found that the activities supported by these funds into a normal, standard, regular country support program has been very, very challenging.
If I could add one thing, Matt, because the Evaluation Network meeting last week, there was sort of interest in a paper which AG has done on strengthening evaluation arrangements in partnerships, including global funds, and the things we've got from that. CG will be planning to hold a one-day workshop for partners in the fall on these issues, and with more information available if anybody is particularly interested in sort of need for partnership arrangements.
Looking across the sectors for World Bank engagement, we have found that there are very different partnership experiences. For example, in the education sector, this Education for All Fast Track initiative was the main channel for working with partners. It's fully integrated with the bank system and worked really, really well. We know we have the information about how each program is run. In the health sector, the national intermediary funds was really the biggest. They big as the overall lending put together in the health sector. And especially for special disease related to intervention, they are 5 times of the bank's lending envelope to address the diseases. So, and since these are not at all integrated into the bank system, it's very difficult for the bank to see how they work together for us to assess the success of these. So that's a particular challenge. At the country engagement level, what we found, once again, this is, some of the constraints of a desktop analysis is that we reviewed the document, and through the document, we could see that PP and the HIPIC initiatives played a key role in aligning the donors and the countries together to achieve certain results, but MDGs did not to be a major instrument for donor alignment. Of course, we have to acknowledge that PRSDs were prepared to support the MDGs, so maybe it's through that channel, but through our desk review, we really couldn't see much role for MDGs in terms of donor coordination. And IEG's evaluations, as well as the evaluations by other agencies, put out some key weaknesses or areas that really need improvement. One is the funding sustainability of these trust funds. These funds to have a limited lifespan, and the big question is, after these projects and the country sustain the results being achieved. Another issue, of course, is what I mentioned many times, is the integration and coordination with the long-running, the regular programs the World Bank implement in the country, how to integrate these funds that's kind of time-bound into a more longer-term support program. That has always been the challenge. So the final message, which is an area that we identified to be the weak point for the World Bank groups to support for MDGs, is this the lack of a results, a clear articulation of a results chain. The World Bank groups' roles, approaches, and expected contributions to the MDGs. What we found was, of course, this is not just an issue for the World Bank, but it was a problem for the whole MDG framework. Not enough attention was paid to set up a system to articulate what could be expected out of the sort. What we saw was, on the one hand, that the World Bank Group did make an effort to strengthen the results management agenda I listed some in this slide, and that starts even before the MDGs were adopted. There was an effort to identify performance indicators that could be measured with baselines and targets. So there is this drive to be accountable for the results. And over time, there is a greater emphasis to use the MDGs into the results tracking within the World Bank Group, both and start with the IDA at the entry program level, and even for our private sector arm of the institution, the IFC, they developed their own IFC development goals. These represented a first attempt to measure results among investment. It's very challenging, but that was a first effort to do that. At the country level, the World Bank did try to build up the statistical capacity of the client countries. However, what we found was that this was never really a key objective in the country program. They rarely figure in the results matrices, and the support was very uneven. And even we found that in some of the poorest countries, the countries that lacked capacity the most, actually the bank's support was the least. A part of this was again driven by country demand, but that's clearly a problem for countries that's lagging in data. Actually, the World Bank provided less support in terms of creating the data. Once again, just to repeat that the major weakness is when we consider everything the bank did over the last 15 years, was this is the main area. There was no articulation of the results. And because the bank's support sometimes was not directly in the areas of the MDG measures, the indicators or targets, but on, for example, creating the systems, the governance, there's a clear need to create intermediate outcomes and link these outcomes to the final, the high-level goals in order to enable us to assess the contribution and impact and draw lessons. Currently, this mechanism is not there, which is really a big handicap. So I think that's all I have to say, and I welcome questions and look to a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Shaolin. We will now move on to the next presenter, Olivier.
The questions towards the
I think so. Let's finish the presentation first.
So, hopefully we show up on the system. If not, I can use your. Yes, thanks. So let's click. I need to click on that arrow, right? Okay. I'll try and do that. Yes. Presentation, a very short presentation, hopefully, of evaluation that took pretty much a year of work last year. In 2014, we just presented it at the board early June, and it's been completed pretty much months ago. So it's kind of an old story for us, but I'll try to remember the main points. And I must say also that it is an evaluation. So as opposed to perhaps what Sharon has presented, she premised by saying this is just a review. We try hard to do an evaluation. So therefore, we have perhaps a little more, somewhat slightly negative findings sometimes, I think. All my colleagues did. To me, that I had made for once too positive an evaluation. I don't think that's the case. I think we did cover quite a few problems. But so, basically, the scope of the evaluation was very, very wide. We were asked by the executive board to try and explore the contribution of MDGs, of UNDP to the MDGs achievement at country level. As you might imagine, this is quite a wide remit, because a lot of what UNDP does could be seen as contributing to the MDGs in one way or another. So the way we scoped it was to just focus on work that pertained to all the MDGs as a package. So any work to monitor the achievements of the MDGs as a whole was in the scope, but any work to study the particular progress achieved against one particular MDG, that's outside of our scope. For any sectorial program, we're excluded of the scope, and this means that we have, of course, underestimated the UN contribution to the MDGs because, say, for example, work under the environment funded by the GEF is not included in this work, although it would be under MDG 7. A quick review of the findings. The UNDP did a number of things in support of the MDGs. The first thing is likely to administer the MDG campaign, the Millennium campaign. Sorry. The Millennium campaign, while it's set up technically a little bit at a distance from UNDP, was still managed by UNDP and administered by UNDP. And that campaign, the main goal was to try and socialize the goals, if you wish, to try and raise awareness around the world around the MDGs, because the MDGs had been decided here in New York, shortlisted by a small group of people, etc., etc. So this idea that the world out there was not really committed to them, and therefore there was it for a campaign. This is one channel. The other channel was the country offices of UNDP themselves. Did some campaigning here or there. The two channels were not connected, interestingly, and we'll come back to that. The campaign focused on donor countries, namely Japan and in Europe, where countries there, African countries, and also poor Asian nations. That geographic focus was driven by a number of criteria, such as poverty levels, for example. It was also driven very often by individual contacts. And the result, that geographic focus was rather narrow, we conclude. And one of the work done by the campaign in later years was called the Stand Up for Poverty campaign, which basically said to people around the globe that they should stand up collectively against poverty, physically stand up, I mean. This campaign reached out to hundreds of millions of people. Probably the most successful campaign managed by UNDP ever in terms of the number of people reached through it, but the problem was linked to policy outcomes. Nobody really understood what difference it would make to stand up against poverty. So people said, yeah, we stood up, but we don't really get it. We don't really understand the connection here. The impacts of the Millennium campaign on donors were definitely noted. Also, the campaigning work helped maintain commitment in developing countries towards the goal. It's not very clear that it developed or expanded commitments that was before it's inexistent. I think it just reinforced pre-existing commitments. Another big role played by UNDP during that period was to the role called the scorekeeper, asked by the Secretary General to facilitate or support the production of national MDG reports in all developing countries. And so that has been an intense area of work since the beginning of the era, with approximately 450 reports produced globally with UNDP assistance. This includes, most of them are national reports. Most countries produce 2 or 3 or 4 reports, but quite a number of countries produce much more than that. And some countries produced subnational reports, a series of reports at the level of each province or district within the country. There's a massive area of work for UNDP. I think we can say that it's operational success in the sense that a lot has been done as reports were used. Only they helped improve data management, especially on poverty. They also maintained commitment for the goals nationally, and wonder why they attracted attention to an issue, a development issue that had neglected until then. They were quoted in the media as fairly safe and fairly transparent, and so although of course they didn't save the world, those reports served the purpose for which they were intended. One weakness we identified there is the insufficient involvement of UN agencies, in particular specialized UN agencies, in the preparation of those reports. Of course, they were typically involved or invited, but involvement was usually weaker dated in the guidance documents of UNDP itself. The problem here is that a lot of this development data is actually not so simple to interpret and to analyze. So without the presence of specialized agencies around the table, it's possible that some of those reports may gloss over, weaknesses in data, or may provide perhaps rosy interpretation for the data that's presented. The issue here, it's less important probably, is the fact that the global reporting system on data, which Alan will talk about later, I understand, and the country level reports supported by UNDP were totally disconnected. UNDP made a try to compile at the global level all the country level reports in days on a website that was called the MDG Monitor. It was set up in, if memory serves, in 2007, and it was never ever updated after that. And so this is kind of a telling case, if you wish, of an issue that we uncovered in other areas, which is that UNDP pushed the MDGs through to the country level very well. But when to learning from the country level, when into compiling information that was arrived at or compiled at the country level, then there was a big weakness. And finally, the third large area of work in supporting planning and programming for the MDGs. So that was mainly implemented after 2005, when there was a review summit. We highlighted the fact that so many countries had, on paper, committed to the MDGs, but in fact hadn't done anything to implement them. So a big push to try and align development strategies with the MDGs, in particular the PRSPs, of which Shaolun spoke before, consisted a focus area in this work. And the entire generation of PRSPs was aligned in this way with the MDGs. We discuss exactly what it means to align a PRSP to the MDGs, different levels of integration alignment here, definitely from the referential to a more solid use of goals as targets and aims. Now, the national level, there was also a strong demand for the MDGs in subnational planning. Very, very strong, in particular in lower middle-income countries and high middle-income countries, to address geographic inequalities. That work was supported by UNDP, but not very aggressively or strongly, I must say. You helped the MDGs through a research project which was called the Millennium Project. They worked a lot on the macroeconomics of the MDGs, and this work, together with the work of the World Bank, led to what many donors called astronomic figures, countries. But in fact, when you look at those figures and when you look at the amount of ODA that has come to a number of countries during the era, numbers were not so astronomic, and we conclude that UNDP, with others, make the case that it was perfectly doable macroeconomically to increase ODA. In other words, there's an argument at the time that ODA not be increased without causing massive addition in fragile economies. And he sort of argued against that. Clear programmatic impact in some cases, generally an expansion of social sectors outreach in a number of countries that have in their development plans with the MDGs. While we've seen some cases where, therefore, there was an expansion of the social sectors, there were also other cases where we saw UNDP planning work as a little bit superficial, whereby basically to simplify a little bit, they came in places and sprinkle MDG magic onto plans without thinking that those plans needed to be funded, needed to be implemented in order to translate into something concrete. So we'll come back to that, but there's quite a few cases where we think that UNDP took planning as a little bit of a superficial approach to development. Now, internal efficiency and management issues within the organization. There isn't much to say there, except to say that in general, the products and guidelines that we reviewed were well designed and well timed. So, general good quality of the work, if you wish. Country office leadership, by that we mean the reps in country, was a major factor explaining performance at the country level. A major factor, of course, was the appetite of the national government for the MDG agenda. Also was quite varied. We found it, just as a comment for what Xiaolong just said, we did in our sample that such appetite for the MDG was stronger in low-income countries and low-middle-income countries. In other words, interest drops when you go into upper middle-income countries and countries. Country leadership, a major performance factor. Again, echoing a little bit what the World Bank was saying, we found that a lot of trust funds and units were set up in ways that were disconnected from the mainstay of UNDP work in country. This is an issue because generally they did not add up too much in country. They did not come up with interesting MDGs. And finally, as I was saying before, UNDP was much more efficient rolling down tools and learning from countries. Words about what it led to. The MDG is a good idea to start with. Because it's all good and mellow that the UNDP contribute to the MDGs, but if the MDGs were the wrong thing to do, then it's not that. So, generally speaking, most people in the industry, so to speak, consider it as a success. They, for a very small level of outcome or achievement, is that they provided a common language, a safe language, to talk about ODA and development. And from that perspective, the broadening of the now MDGs to issues such as anti-corruption is probably because it will allow, hopefully, the international community to talk about anti-corruption in a much more free manner than was the case before. Another that it provided an agreed and simple metric for development. This we've seen as help maintain commitments in countries when they were, say, Ethiopia was seeing that Kenya was doing better. The things you had a degree of emulation between countries that helped maintain commitment. Also to more development data, easier to access data, although a lot remains to be done on that front. However, on the minus side, we see in a number of countries that the rush for numbers has led, in some cases, to low quality of social services, particularly in education. In other words, when you go for quantity, well, you sacrifice on quality. Finally, at the level of development discourse and discussion, pushback, the MDGs help push back against a narrowly growth-centric view of development, help fund an expansion of social sectors, and that's, again, a similarity with what the World Bank was saying before. There's quite a few countries who like this MDG social sector expansion aspect, but they are saying nowadays, for example, in the Common African Position, the MDGs and the expansion of social sectors more generally is sustained without economic growth. And fairly obvious when you think of it. An area of ODA increased. I think that much is clear. More aid going to health and education. However, it's almost impossible to disentangle the impact of the MDGs only from the impact of other similar initiatives. And the work in UNDP was minded this risk mobilization domain. This graph is just to illustrate the growth in ODA during the MDG era. The two lines represent a total ODA disbursement by DAC members. Blue, it's in constant prices, 2012 prices, and in red, it's as percent of world GDP. Whatever the way we dice this, ODA was going down before the MDGs and started to rebound after the MDGs. And recommendations. In crafting those, we looked at what the future has in store. Of course, the SDGs, as they are shaping up, will be very different from the MDGs. So the degree to which you can use what you've learned in the MDG era for the SDG era, to be said, is fairly limited. The graph up there is taken from a blog, the poverty blog of The Guardian, and it illustrates at the bottom you have the MDGs, at the top you have the SDGs. You can see, and they're connected to see which one leads to which one. I see there are many more SDGs than MDGs, and they're touching broader remits. So that a few conclusions and recommendations can be made for the future. First of all, the conclusions. The basic concepts of the MDGs has largely been validated by experience. You can always criticize them as you can criticize anything, but we come to the conclusion that the basic concepts and strategies were validated. UNDP has rolled out an impressive set of tools in support of the MDGs, and that were really of high quality and worldwide. A conclusion is about the limited involvement of specialized UN agencies. That emerged as a weakness not only in the MDG reports, but also in planning, also in the MDG acceleration framework, which I haven't talked about today, but is part of planning. It's an issue that's, and perhaps the reason for it, that UNDP was so dominant beginning of the MDG era on the MDG, if you wish, that it sort of crowded out specialized agencies. Another explanation is that for specialized agencies, the MDGs were at the beginning perceived as a gimmick. They were so simple that they were as simplistic. UNDP sized on them early on, and specialized agencies didn't, and this led to problems in the end. So an excessive attention to planning by UNDP without thinking through realistic means of implementations. And what we've seen in the countries that we've reviewed is that the eruption of crisis, for example, accounts for half of all cases where there was a nice little MDG plan that never implemented. That in more than half the cases where UNDP supported the implement of national development strategies with the MDGs, there was implementation of that plan. So planning for nothing, if you wish, and that's where I'm trying to say that, okay, now planning is certainly a good avenue, but we need to take into consideration that not all planning will lead to results. We need to take into consideration the factors that affect effectiveness of planning. So recommendation 4, programming assistance on processes that have good implementation prospects. Now, it's easier said than done. Of course, when you are at a particular time, you don't know if a planning process will lead to a result in the future. But you have to make a call of whether it's a superficial or unlikely to result in anything type of process, or whether a genuine process. I mean, in the sample, we found that UNDP supported an MDG strategy in Somalia in 2011. I mean, how is that? For all sorts of reasons. There's plenty of other things happening in Somalia than the MDGs. I call on UNDP to be a little more cautious there. Then recommendation is to finish off the country reports with a round of reports to finish the period. Second recommendation is that in the future, UNDP should, of course, do several work that relates with the SDGs. UNDP works on governance, works on crisis, and these two aspects are well covered in the SDGs. But we argue that there is still a role for at least somebody, and we think UNDP can play that role, to provide advice at the level of the entire agenda, because it's all nice and mellow to have 16 or 17 goals, but they cannot be achieved in isolation. So they're all connected, so that somebody should do that work of trying to look at balance and coherence among them. The role the UNDP played during the MDG era, we didn't find them grossly inappropriate or anything like that. So we think they should be continued while enhanced with work with the other UN agencies. And finally, we did find a bit difficult during our evaluation to assess information in a systematic way. We find very little in terms of systematic compiled information. And we find also that this was perhaps related to the fact that the cadre of advisors that had been working on the MDGs have often changed, rapid rotation of staff. So for the next era, we recommend to maintain a stable cadre of advisors and also to document country-level work in a much more systematic way than before. That's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Olivier. Now we move on to the third presenter, last but not least, Ellen, please.
Great. I think because we are all eager to have the discussion, I can be brief, which might first, but I'll try. So just to start, and I'm going to skip over some of the methodology and other things like that. People are curious, we can talk about it in the discussion period. But just start, this I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you. This evaluation, whose the overarching purpose of which was to assess the effectiveness of the MDG monitoring and evaluation framework, with focus, like the title says, on learning lessons for the post-2015 era. So their overarching objectives. The inception phase, we identified a need to map out the different components of the Germany framework. What got up here in this slide is as you may recognize it from the report, it is our mapping of the components that make up the framework. And as just pointed out with regard to UNDP, there really is a need for more systematic kind of orientation. And take it even a step back from one of the things that was said in the context of the World Bank's work, I think it was pointed out that there was no clear results chain. Well, not only that, there was no clarity about who was even involved that we could find significant documentation on. So this is to show that, from the point of view of when perspective, that you've got the governmental bodies at the top, some of the flow components, including, just as a for instance, because it's a little hard to read up there, but for instance, the Chief Executive Board, CEB, engaged in some work on MDG country reviews. On the other end, on the regional side, if this was a bit higher in terms of the font, you would be able to see the country reports that UNDP is engaged in, the variety of regional reports done by the UN Regional Commission. So it's pretty telling that we had to start our work by kind of going around. Everybody that we interviewed, key players, said to us, well, we really know what the framework is. So we started calling it, the framework in quotes. So that's kind of our first point. Let's see. Okay, let me do that. Thank you. Let me jump, as I said, right over the methodology. These are the 8 lessons learned. Perhaps I won't read them all since they're up there, and I'll just jump around. But they're very much in line with a lot of what's been said already. So I think if you were to triangulate 3 evaluations or the 2 evaluations and the synthesis review we talked about today, the good news would be that there's a lot of synchronicity. Just an example, lesson, let's see, he kind of picks up on a concept that was referred to in the UNDP work, and that is that here it's a little more specific, but that there needs to be clarity about who the expert group that follows the process is. And in fact, this interagency and expert group on MDG indicators was a real strength, I think, in the process. But you can hand that out to say there has to be more continuity that reaches out a bit more widely, not just at the global level, but then to the regional and national level. Again, know that I want to walk through all of these, maybe to read the last 3 to give a little more flavor. We found that monitoring information needs to be sufficiently accessible. Data showed, too, that there was a provision for rigorous evaluation on the achievement of progress that wasn't being fulfilled. And then found showing that when differences exist in stakeholder views of accountability, this becomes fairly relevant in terms of monitoring and evaluating. That's okay. Effectively, no, not surprising. So the next slide, please. These 2 slides perhaps go together a bit. This OIOS's attempt to depict at a conceptual level how evaluation has the potential to be a bridge between monitoring and accountability. And it's fairly, well, I believe it's somewhat self-explanatory. You can see all the different levels there. And then the idea that if you've got some evaluation groups or cycles, that can have a positive effect on accountability across all of the dimensions, global, regional, national, and local. And I'll just go to the next slide. Taking that down to one more level of detail, and again, picking up on some of the things that have been said with regard to the World Bank and UNDP work, here we sought to show, in maybe slightly more confusing fashion, but to show a bit more detail and show some of the components that might be a part of an ongoing evaluation framework. So what's being depicted here is that perhaps there is consider annual monitoring that feeds into, just as an example, 5-year cycles where you've got at every 5-year juncture comprehensive evaluation or synthesis, however one wants to look at it. And this is at a fairly high level, but this is very much missing. In fact, as part of our evaluation, we attempted to identify where all the MDG evaluations were, and of course that's challenging because you could argue that everything is an MDG evaluation, but nevertheless it was very, we actually had to sort of abort the analysis and just say that everything is very much in an ad hoc manner, and it would be very hard for anybody, even looking into a particular MDG, to have any sense of how could they get a picture overall of where at any given point with regard to success. Take us to the next slide. This is a draft recommendation that we put forward. For those that don't know, our reports typically go before an intergovernmental body, which committee of the General Assembly called CPC, and we recommended to them that as part of the ongoing that there should be consideration to having the Secretary General formulate an overarching strategy and action plan, which would support coherent, coordinated monitoring and evaluation of achievement towards the MDGs. And again, some more specifics there, which I won't take the time to read through, but I can just tell you that I'm, we can go to the next slide, in a somewhat rare position when you're an evaluator at the UN to be able to tell you that in context of the UNDP report, which is 6 months past, this report is very much alive. I just came from the CPC session where they're still talking about this report, and so I would take the opportunity to share, essentially because these are ongoing deliberations, but they're nearing the end. So it's interesting for us to note as evaluators that a lot of their discussion has been around, not surprisingly for those of you that are familiar with CPC, a lot of their discussion has been around whether or not the OIOS evaluation report went beyond its intended mandate. The point being, should OIOS be presenting lessons learned for consideration when the 2015 intergovernmental deliberations are underway? Just something interesting to keep in mind. I mean, our mandate is to be relevant, so to have done this without that orientation seems a bit questionable from our perspective. But one does, as we knew this would be the case, we were a bit careful with our language, and they have, in fact, become quite receptive. And after some discussion about the terminology, why is there accountability terminology when the deliberations have moved to follow-up and review, etc., they ultimately do look like they're going to accept our recommendation, which originally they were saying was very premature. What was the word that they was? Premature. Very, very strong synonym for premature. They now are noting, prejudges, that's what it was. The draft recommendation was being by some member states to be judging possible outcomes, but it now looks like they will note it, not definitively endorsing, but noting it. So it's just an interesting lesson because we had debate. Errol was my chief for, and those who don't, during this evaluation, we had some debate about whether or not we should have a recommendation. And Errol, I thought, made the interesting point that my original, I'm kind of risk adverse, so my original thing was, we're going to get in trouble, they're going to slap our hands, let's not put it in and let them receptive to the rest of the information in the conclusion, etc. And Errol, being a bit more of a creative soul and a risk taker, said, no, let's go ahead and put the recommendation in because it will engage people in dialogue. And in fact, I think he was right. We did see more engagement because we took that little bit of a risk, but it's just regardless of what your intergovernmental body is or how you do your work, I think it's a little bit of an interesting lesson learned for us in terms of balancing relevance and receptivity. So and there, just the other piece just had to do with what other opportunities might exist for UNEG.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Ellen. We have about 25 more minutes we can for a general discussion. Now at this time, I'd like to invite Harold Hauge, who's our Deputy Director of IEO, Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. He's currently with us, but then, as I mentioned, he used to work for UNOIOS as the Chief of Section and Mediation Division. And he's also worked at the World Bank, so he's in a really good position to give us to kick off the general discussion and perhaps first question and answer session.
Very much, Fumika. First, there's lastly on your point of introduction. No, I haven't actually worked at the World Bank. I worked for some time consultant to the World Bank. Now, in kicking off the questions and discussions, rather than pick up on my former association and role with the IOS, I'm going to throw out the contributors, all three, the proposition that in the three respective exercises, we are, for all practical purposes, in a certain manner of speaking, dealing with how the respective organizations MDG agenda. None of the reports actually address any kind of association between respective organizations, actual progress the MDGs itself. I know for so many good reasons the sort of causal associations are pretty intractable, but if that leaves, what would your answer be to the proposition that the MDGs would have been progress against the MDGs whether our organizations existed or not? Once these had been set, it's all a certain attention to the issue, but arguably what the progress made had nothing to do with any of the actions that our organizations did. Some people would argue we're leaving that question to proposition of faith, a badge of organizational loyalty. If we don't answer the question, who does?
Thank you. Does any of the, first of all, the three presenters want to comment on Arrow?
I could take a shot at that. We tried to close that gap, if you wish, between the work of UNDP and the achievement of the MDGs. We did try hard to show a causal contribution there. I don't think it was wise to even try. One of the persons in BDP to whom I presented this work commented on our courage, and I think that meant, in fact, what a fool you are even to try that, because there's so many different factors that come into play that it's evidently quite impossible to do. One thing I can say that I'm convinced about after this evaluation, I'd say it's proven. I'm personally I am to that conclusion. I'm convinced that the evidence I have, are sufficient to convince me at least, is that the MDG agenda would probably have been totally forgotten for a number of UN agencies, in particular UNDP, role in trying to support them. I'm saying this because I've seen at least one country, or even two countries in our sample, where it was forgotten, until UNDP started to say, hey, let's do something about them around 2007 or 2008. So there's been many lofty goals in the past, so many conferences, and a lot of them have been forgotten. One lesson from the MDGs is you don't do these things, just like I was saying, you don't do planning without looking at means of implementation and how to translate that into reality. The lesson of the MDGs, I think, is you don't create a lofty global agenda if you're able to keep painting and banging on your drums and trying to do something about them. UNDP has done that again and again over the period. It has drummed the beat of MDGs. That's already something. Now, as everybody knows of this CSAs, China is responsible for a good chunk, something like 25%, or I don't want to say something wrong, but a very big chunk of progress against the first MDG. And it did not formally approve the MDGs or adopt the MDGs until 2010, 2011. So it's perfectly possible to achieve the MDGs without referring to them, because they're not new things. They reflect parties and past agendas. It's not like they are any fact. No, please, that'd be my answer.
Just to leave comments, I'd be interested to hear other points. I think you made a good point.
Nick or Charlotte?
Okay, I will try. This is an interesting question, of course, and I think it's a question on everybody's mind, is how much as an institution World Bank group contributed to the MDGs. Unfortunately, actually, for our exercise, we specifically avoided that question for some very specific questions and reasons. First of all is the nature of our exercise really doesn't allow that. It's very limited time bound and it's a desk study. To answer some question like that, of that magnitude, it's just impossible, so we don't want it to. It really, the scope of the exercise doesn't allow that. Secondly, I don't think the IG has had really to devote resources to try to answer that question, because this is something ultimately we don't think we were able to answer anyhow, because MDGs are such high level. So goals, well, the bank's operations at a much lower level. In the large scheme of things, it's such a small in the whole universe of what needs to be created in order to achieve the MDGs. So I think we will be able to do that. And finally, this is something I mentioned in my presentation, is that a lot of the interventions of the World Bank is called enabling environment. For example, in the health area, the bank probably did not address the disease, which are measured by the MDGs, but is more focusing on the health systems and the financing, sustainability. These issues are critical, but it's hard to link them directly to the MDG measured results. So this is one reason why we emphasize to articulate the results chain. It's okay for the World Bank to go after some intermediate outcomes, some other issues, financing system, for example, governance system, for example, but then there should be some articulation of how that goal links or contributes to the high-level goal. But now that for the MDG area, there was no such articulation, and ex post, we don't want to impose on the results chain and then try to see did they achieve something they didn't even set to achieve. So that's another reason. And that going forward, this is a suggestion and implication for our colleagues in innovation to do that, so that we can continuously assess whether or not we are achieving our declared objectives, and if not, what to do. But when it is completely absent, exposed, we cannot really impose the goals or the system to see if they met the target or not.
Charlene, I think at this time we'd like to open the floor for the general sort of discussion with the audience. There are a couple of people who are online who have questions, and also I believe we have a few in the room as well. Let me go to this question. You were first. What's his name? David Akana, are you online?
Oh, yes, I'm online. My name is David Akana, and I work for the Independent Development Evaluation function of the African Development Bank. Listening to the colleague from UNDP, I must say that it's a little disheartening to listen to him speak, in part because in this part of the world there is a lot of hope with the SDGs. We're hoping that this could significantly ameliorate the poverty situation in this part of the world. But listening to him say that setting the goals is one thing, and of course measuring them and implementing them is another, and using lessons from the MDGs, I tend to be a little bit worried. So the question is, from your perspective, what do you think with respect to, do you think in setting the SDGs, have we learned any lesson with respect to measurement and making sure that we are learning the lessons from the MDGs in terms of implementing the SDGs? I know there's quite a good number of groups at the UN that have been working in terms of, tightening the outcomes, the indicators, and the targets at this point. So the question is, do you think we've learned sufficiently on that, and is there a likelihood that we would be able to measure the SDGs a lot better and then have better outcome on the ground?
question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Elhan Seyfi. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I had 3 questions, if I may. Relates to the question that was raised by by Errol. And I think that maybe the way to go about this is to formulate the question differently. I understand that this is obviously a way of trying to understand what it is that the institutional impact of these various organizations is in terms of achieving the goals. But perhaps we should be asking the individual country offices as well as the governments within the countries to what extent the MDGs have been impacting them. And the reason for why I bring this up is because I was at an event yesterday where the permanent representative of Kenya was telling how very disheartened by the way we were talking about the MDGs because they had an actual impact in her country. And there were many, Rwanda, and how, you know, that, so the experience that she had on the ground was quite different. But that was just a comment, if I may. I had one question to Shaolin at the World Bank, and my question was with regard to point 5. You mentioned the weak data and the countries where there has been kind of a lack of data, the World Bank has been less active. And I was wondering to what extent this kind of data-driven approach has been kind of present obstacles to the kind of work that we do, in fact, in these countries, and the extent to which the World Bank has been getting involved with its work within the different countries with its work on MDGs. And a second question I had was with regards to point 1, and you mentioned how the World Bank has always been, or had already previously, prior to the MDGs, been involved in kind of MDG work, and I was wondering to what extent you can disaggregate where there have been more impactful than other areas. Which goals have they already been working on versus others, and to what extent has kind of this different goals and targets impact continued work. And my question to Olivier was about the limited involvement of the other organizations, the various agencies. And I was wondering to what extent that has to do with the fact that the MDGs were seen as a UNDP agenda. So the whole idea of the UNDP being the scorekeeper, the campaign manager, the thing that we know is that post-MDGs, the budget of UNDP goes up drastically. It was going on, and after that, we go up drastically throughout the 2000s. And to what extent that was seen as a sign of, okay, UNDP has been given this mandate, and there is no reason for us to be getting as involved as we should. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, hi, I'm Tony Doe from IOM. This is very interesting, and thank you very much for inviting us. It's the first heard I've heard about the MDGs and SDGs. I find it interesting that from a monitoring point of view and monitoring and evaluation. My question for Olivier, your report, your evaluation, to what extent did it impact the evaluation of the SDGs? Who reads your report? How does that have an impact on policy for the SDGs? That was interesting.
Okay. Yes, sir.
But you read them. No, I mean, I don't know exactly who reads them from cover to cover. Definitely, that would be a small number. I think we're trying to make those reports useful by delivering the message through many different ways. But we are mandated to work here in the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. Our mandate is to advise the UNDP board. It is not, of course, to advise the member states, or to advise the Secretary General. So, no, the SDGs were not impacted by this evaluation, because we don't have any mandate to advise anybody at that level. That's one. So the reason the SDG discussion started in 2012, very early on, and it's been going on since then. And so we did our evaluation in 2014, fairly late in that process. So I think that would explain. No, of course, there's no impact. And then tying up with the question by the gentleman from the African Development Bank on our learning from the lessons of the MDGs in CG. Now, I'm not qualified to answer that question other than by giving my opinion, because again, we are mandated to look only at what UNDP has been doing, but from what I can see, there's very little lessons learning from one era to the next. I know this may sound a bit disheartening, but it looks like since the MDG, I mean, this global agenda called the MDGs, were somewhat really successful in obtaining the approval of different partner actors, and since there's some general good feeling about their utility in the discourse, in the negotiation of aid, etc., certainly people want to do even more with the SDGs, and therefore they have in fact forgotten, in my personal view, I'm not speaking for UNDP here, the people who are discussing these things, I believe, are forgetting a very simple principle that put it over the MDG relation, and that principle was to say we need something simple. We need all these lofty discussions in Geneva, in Washington, in New York, London, or Paris, or wherever, and all these agreements are signed and declarations made, but the common man, the common person does not understand any of it, does not trust any of it. And so one way of fighting back a certain skepticism vis-a-vis aid, vis-a-vis UNEG, etc., was precisely to boil down all this complex discussion, very simple of goals. This worked. I'm afraid that we've forgotten that idea. I'm also a bit disheartened by listening to Alan. I'm wondering whether there isn't among member states a certain degree of nervousness of a stronger M&E framework. But when you think of the MDG era, 15 years, the development debate has been dominated by those MDGs. Now, it would seem logical that there would be a large number of evaluations at the end of this period to look at this work, no? And we started this evaluation. We did try to reach out to other UN agencies, at least, to try to do that together, and there was very little appetite at the moment. And I will finish with a question of Herman on the MDG UNDP agenda, or perceived as UNDP agenda. There was certainly, and I don't think I'm releasing any secret there, there was certainly a degree of frustration, in particular in UNICEF, also in other specialized agencies, but UNICEF had been at the forefront of all these discussions. You have to remember that the Child Summit was the first time that a global agenda was agreed upon through a UN summit of some sort. And that provided a little bit the blueprint for the later summits. And UNICEF had a very strong engagement in that discussion at the global level. And I'm certain, because some people from UNICEF told me, that there was a degree of resentment in 2001 when the Secretary General nominated UNDP as the scorekeeper and campaign manager for the MDGs. And indeed, that may explain a little bit this problem. I don't think it's the only reason, honestly. I feel very often in practice, after 2 years had passed, the UNICEF was totally on board and quite a few other agencies, but we had to do an MDG report, and you had to, big deadline. Well, if you had to do a real negotiation and discussions with the UNICEF and the FAO and the shows of this world, you would have needed 2 more months. And, well, people cut corners, and they decided that it was more expedient and fast to do a light touch consultation. That, well, maybe it was expedient and they worked. Now with the SDGs, definitely it's not going to work. The agenda is so much more complex that we need all the help we can get to monitor it.
Yes. Can I just make a couple comments? One related to the question here. Thank you for the questions, but also picking up on a lot of what you've said. Just maybe starting off with your question, I think you bring up a very important point about should we not be asking the individual countries, and this is particularly, it's pertinent to me, just have gone to just, we only did as a case study, we went to Tanzania, but we spoke to all the players there, the government officials, the NGOs, the think tanks, the whole range of stakeholders, certainly the whole UNDP country team, and we did a lot. And I'm not saying that the typical case we actually chose it because it was seen by many to be a good example of where there was traction and there was an appetite. I think it just and you spoke to the diversity in terms of the degree of appetite, and I think we very much saw that when we looked at the document and looked at case, in that case study, and then looked at other related engagements. It's a really important point. It's particularly important because one of the main ideas, and maybe where there is now some against monitoring and evaluation, is in the countries that are saying, look, this should be a national-led agenda. It shouldn't be a top-down. Coming back to your comments, which we certainly heard that when we heard it everywhere, that the MDG agenda felt like it was pushed down on the countries that I think common knowledge, although it's an overgeneralization. But so now idea from the very start, since 2012, when the negotiations have started on the post-2015 agenda, the idea has been that needs to be entirely swift. And every stakeholder we spoke to at the country or the regional level was very much, that's where they started their conversation with us. This is what needs to change. But it raises a lot of challenges, right? I mean, when you had something that worked well because it was simplistic, and sometimes the reporting happened on time or well because there was the choice to narrow things, which is not positive or negative choice, really. It has pros and cons. It has costs and benefits. But now you're talking about an agenda which is intended to be universal, which is very complicated and complex, and you're talking about having country-level ownership, and which I didn't touch on because I wanted to be very brief, but there are big capacities here, both in terms of statistical capacity at the country level, even in the countries that had the largest appetite and the best resources, huge issues. So I think these are the comments you've made and the question you've asked, I think are very key comments, and it's a very key question at this juncture in terms of the post-2015 agenda. However it is determined by the member states, these are very pertinent issues.
There are a couple of questions to Shaolin. Shaolin, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. So I would like to answer the questions directly just to me. One is about the point number 5 about data. Indeed, this is the conclusions that we drew from the in-depth review of 9 countries, and we did find that definitely, first of all, it is critical to have accurate data. That's absolutely necessary to make a good policy, to have a plan, to design a sensible program and to implement it correctly, and continuously learn from what's going well, what's not going so well, and how to adjust. Without data, that's impossible to do. Actually, I was just, we were discussing the program in Cape Verde, for example, this morning, and there, Bank and IMF have been running programs for a number of years without the basic data on the GDP growth, which ought to be false, and that really shakes the foundation of that intervention, a series of interventions. So that should have never happened like that. The first data is very important and it's lacking in many of the countries we work in. Banks' assistance, as I mentioned, has been very uneven, especially seems to be particularly lacking in the poorer, lagging countries, and that's very bad and need to be urgently addressed. Yes, so that is a big lesson, and especially I think the idea is to continuously learning from failure, learning from past mistakes, learning from past experience. Without reliable data, that's just not possible. And so going back to slide 1, the question was, in the past, so before the MDGs were adopted, the bank already changed its orientation, and the interest was a bit more what it meant. So indeed, starting from the 90s, the World Bank group, the development thinking in general is that focus on growth. It's but that's not important. That's not enough. So the bank had this purposely reoriented to give them a lot more emphasis on the social sector. So empowering poor people, empowering people in general to participate in development, and this is reflected in the bank's work program. For example, the lending sectors increased from 5% in the early 1980s to 20% in the late so from 5% to 20% between the early 80s to late 90s. So we're talking about the period before the MDGs. You could already see a fourfold increase in the bank's attention lending to the social sectors. And this trend continued after the MDGs were adopted. And there are particularly, in our report, we have a lot more data, and you're interested, we also refer to a link that has the background notes that's annexed on our website in IAG. So a lot more resources went to IDA.
A grace period, maybe.
The subscription is due.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Shaolan?
I should think, yeah.
Oh.
What's that? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got the gist.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Shaolan. Well, actually, we've come to the ready, but then I know we have two more people for questions. One online. Francois Garcia, are you still there? Yes. Okay. If she's not there, then Tina.
I have three questions, one for Olivier, one for Ellen, and one for all of us. For Olivier, you spoke a little bit about coordination, just mentioning that it's necessary. I'm wondering, so that was part of the scope of the evaluation. Could you say words about coordination at the country level and how effective it has been? And what yourself, Tina, from UNICEF's evaluation of this. So what UNDP's role has been in that, and how effective it has been making efforts at the country level. And regarding in data, one of the things I often hear as a potential issue with the MDGs was that it didn't give specific attention to specific population, and they wasn't sufficiently segregated. Maybe also one of the reasons for why the buy-in from special agencies was low, right? So I was wondering if you could say a few words about this issue and how we can learn from that for the MDGs. And so agenda, I'm thinking UNICEF's equity agenda. And the question for all of us, I was wondering what UNEG's role could be in the SDGs get developed in a more comprehensive way.
One will be for Fumika.
Well, I've recently joined the UNEG Secretariat, and I'm still catching up with my learning of what exactly UNEG has been doing and then will do. But then a lot of activities to try to ensure that we integrate somehow mediation into the whole post-2015 discussion. I can't say I can talk about in detail, but certainly it's one of our activities as part of our work plan this year. I think I have to stop without going too much detail.
On that country level, what we find was that, as you must know, UNDP is a sort of mandated role for the UN system, and there's also in a number of countries, not in all of them by far, role in terms of coordinating the broader donor community. It's very obvious that the MDG agenda reinforced that both roles, but mainly the first. To which UNDP was able to reach out to donors during the MDG era. And when I say reach out, I mean coordinate with them and not only get money from them, but engage them in a discussion about where to do, what to fund, where to fund, etc., etc. So true coordination, not just resource mobilization. The degree to which UNDP was able to contribute to that discussion with donors was, I think, beyond expectations. Expectations. So it's, to come back on this question, it's true that there's been a rise in the funding for UNDP during that period. I doubt it's immediately and 100% certainly not related to the MDGs. The MDGs might have played a role, but let's not overemphasize them, because I don't think that if you take a few big projects like the 20 millions for the Millennium Development Goals, for example, and things like that, you won't see much in terms of resource mobilizations for the MDGs. Much out there. And it's a problem. But in countries where UNDP was able to reach out to and coordinate well with donors, we saw very good results in the end. Say Ethiopia is a hand where UNDP has a key role in donor coordination with the World Bank and others, but does fulfill that role really well, and it did help. It's one piece of the puzzle, but it did help in aligning a lot of funding streams towards the MDGs in Ethiopia, resulting in an expansion in social services in Ethiopia. So that was a good case, and then there were other led cases, such as Madagascar and Mali, where, Mali, you had an MDG aligned plan, you had an appetite by the nation to adopt the MDGs and work on them, and but you had absolutely no connection between UNDP and donors. Very weak connections, very weak positioning of UNDP in its coordination role with donors, and as a result, very little funding for such plans. So, as a result, in two cases, we think it's related. So, we did some decent work in UN coordination, in short. That's that not all agencies were initially interested. On donor coordination, it's below expectations.
I can make points to the question that you might quote from your report, but yes, you're absolutely right that the attention to subpopulations and the lack of disaggregated data, and I even add the lack of timely data, has what we saw as a problem too in terms of and credibility in some instances. So I think you're right that those things have to be worked on among some others if you're going to get higher than at the national level. A few statistics I put in. This was our lesson number 4, that monitoring activities need to be sufficient in terms of their coverage, their disaggregation, the distribution of the data and also timeliness. And just a few statistics from that. We had a reliable source that indicated that only 11% of developing countries have two data maternal mortality. That's a very small number. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy data to collect, but it's not it's not among the most obtuse data that you're after. So we thought that was fairly telling. And also in terms of the disaggregated data, real gaps in terms of data based on gender, wealth quartile, age, disability, population group, localized inequities, as the starting point. We queried one of our methods, which again I did not go into, was to do a survey of all the interagency and expert group members. This is about IAEG on MDGs, that many of you probably know it. And so these are people in the know who are statisticians primarily, et cetera. And over half of those respondents disagreed with the statement that the Millennium Development Goal monitoring and evaluation framework had supported strong incorporation of disaggregated data. So the statistician said, no, it's not happening. And that's, you know, they have a vested interest in saying what was working since they were working on it. So, yeah, you're right.
All right. Unfortunately, we have passed the time already, so we're going to have to close this webinar. But thank you very much for, first of all, to the three presenters for their wonderful presentations. For those of us who are back to our organization, hopefully this discussion was useful, something for as a food for thought. And I'd like to also thank your Hauge for their participation today. Just a final sort of announcement, but then at the Secretariat, we try to organize this type of a webinars. So if anybody from the audience today who would like to present their work, evaluation reports, and use this as a platform, do send us the proposals and be happy to work with you. With that, thank you very much for everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.